worshipped by professors and Latin teachers throughout the ages, Cicero railed against the Greeks and Jews who rallied to the side of the democratic leaders. Impoverished individuals, they often throw our assemblies into confusion. The Greeks are given to shameless lying, the Jews to barbaric superstition. You know how they stick together, how influential they are in informal assemblies, unquote. Does any of that have a familiar ring to it? While republic in form, how democratic was the late republic in actual social content? At the very bottom of the social order was a large slave population. About 1/3 of the entire population was slaves, many of whom were worked to death in the mines and on the plantations, or latifundia as they were called. On the next rung was the great mass of free Romans, the proletariat, many of them ex-slaves or the descendants of slaves who lived at the barest subsistence level in the impoverished towns of Italy. Or they lived crowded into thousands of poorly ventilated, disease-ridden tenements within Rome. Flimsy structures, some of them 8 and 9 floors high, that frequently burned down or collapsed and killed their occupants. No running water, no ventilation, not good. A rung above the property-less proletarians were the farmers and small landholders around the outskirts of the city and beyond. A step above them was the small middle class of minor officials, merchants, and light industry employers. And now looming above this multitude was a few thousand multimillionaires, the class known as equites or equestrians, because their property historically qualified them to serve in the cavalry, in the elite corps. Although by the late Republic, most of them had probably never even been on a horse. The equestrians were state contractors, bankers, traders, tax collectors, and landowners. At the very apex of the social pyramid were the wealthy, landed aristocrats who populated the Roman Senate, who also invested in business and speculation and banking along with the equestrians, but who had vast lands and who lived in obscene luxury and ostentation. The difference between the equestrians and the aristocracy was really more one of lineage than of wealth. They were absentee owners of vast latifundia, which were worked by huge slave populations, and they did very little for the land except work it with slave labor and exploit it, squeeze it for profits. They themselves lived on vast estates. Even Cicero, who was not maybe the very richest among them, owned more than 8 villas, along with numerous inner-city tenements. By the way, very few present-day historians of ancient Rome mention the fact that Cicero was a slumlord who bragged about how profitable his tenements were. They were profitable. One of the ways they were profitable, the rents were so high, the proletariat couldn't afford those rents. They would have to double and triple up, so there was massive overcrowding in these places to be able to scare up enough money to pay the rents. The aristocracy grew still richer by usurping the aega publicus. This was an event that took place, a process that took place, say, in the 3rd century BC right up to the 2nd century BC. In this process, there was these vast, fertile, state-owned lands outside of Rome that for centuries before, for generations, had been farmed by farming collectives, small farming collectives of independent free labor farmers, and they fed the entire city of Rome. And during times of war, when the small farmers were away in the army and the farms couldn't be kept up, the aristocrats bought them up at bargain prices, or they used, increasingly what started happening toward the 2nd century, they would use hired thugs to go in and drive the families off the public land and replace them with slave labor. And that process was pretty much completed by the 2nd century, let's say by 199 BC or something. Or maybe a little later. This process of agrarian displacement, by the way, continues to this day in many parts of the world, including the United States itself. It reinforces the thesis that I've presented in Dirty Truths, which is that wealth creates poverty. We always don't think of it that way. They think of it as a distribution problem, but in fact it's an interrelational, it's a dynamic there. Rome was a republic more in form than content. By the way, nor was the form all that democratic. Almost all major political decisions were taken by the Senate, an aristocratic, non-elective oligarchy, numbering about 600, all men of wealth. The Senate determined foreign policy, appointed provincial governors, and controlled the purse strings of the republic. The Senate controlled the deployment of army units and the appointment of top military commanders. The Senate was elected by nobody. It was an oligarchy, self-appointed, self-selecting. Along with the Senate, there were 2 and then 3 assemblies, organized on the basis of tribal associations and property qualifications. In these assemblies, many more voting units were allocated to the rich. In the tribal assembly, the proletariat got one unit of vote, and the very rich got something like 14 or something, or 20. And so the rich prevailed on most issues. Those attending the assemblies could vote only on proposals submitted by one of the higher magistrates with only a yea or nay and without the right to amend any clause. It's called fast track. They could select candidates only from a list drawn up by public officials, usually Senate appointed, and assembly debate was limited to those who were invited to speak by the summoning magistrate. Robinson finds nothing wrong with this arrangement. He writes, quote, "Those who bore the chief burden of fighting and financing the city's wars should also possess the chief voice in directing the city's course." Well, in fact, the very rich did not bear the chief burden of fighting. That dangerous task fell mostly on the shoulders of the common yeoman. In fact, the rich senators did not carry much, if any, of the financial burden. They paid no taxes. They lent money to the state that was paid back to them with interest from funds the state raised by taxing others at home and abroad. So you had this combination of deficit spending and regressive taxes that amounted to an upward redistribution of income. Does that sound familiar? To run for election, one had to be either wealthy or have the support of wealthy backers. The buying of votes was widespread. Rarely did candidates represent discernible principles or programs. So to distinguish themselves from each other, they emphasized their personal qualities, their integrity and leadership, the prestige of their family name, their association with important personalities of the day, their past public service, and their heroic war records. Does any of that sound familiar? The only thing missing was television, I would say. Within the Senate itself, control was concentrated in an inner struggle of 20 or so aristocratic families, both of patrician and plebeian origin. The thing we always heard about the patricians versus the plebeians was over, at least by 2 centuries. That was, rich plebeians were now in the Senate and they were part of the aristocracy. So if you had enough money, after a while, after enough generations, you move in. Although, of course, there were still genealogies and people were perfectly aware who was in the patriciate and who wasn't. But many of the richest senators were plebeians and reactionary and arch conservatives. This elite group in the Senate, by the middle of the 2nd century, by the time of Tiberius Gracchus, who I'm going to talk about later, it divided into 2 groups. The larger one being the optimates, literally the best men, as they modestly called themselves. They were the conservatives devoted to expanding the political economic privileges of the rich and the well-born. The smaller faction in the Senate of this elite group were called populares, and they were reformers with democratic tendencies who sometimes sided with the common people against the Senate itself. The popular assemblies were not entirely without influence. On exceptional occasions, with enough unity and mass mobilization, they could pass measures contrary to the dominant faction in the Senate. But that was not often the case. Modern-day historians are perfectly aware, by the way, that the Senate enjoyed a near monopoly of power, undemocratic power, and yet they're filled with praise for these oligarchs, describing them. I'll give you a composite of quotes here. Bred to a strong tradition of cautious sanity and self-restraint, stout-hearted, level-headed and patriotic,